Hello, you've done really well if you've got this far through the series, but we're now into Genesis 3. We started at Genesis 1:27 and we're going through to Genesis 4. And we've actually got down in Genesis 3 to the point at the end of verse 6 when the man and the woman have eaten of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in order to be like God and to judge for themselves what's good and what's evil, to know that difference. But of course, the idea of beings as small and insignificant as male and females on this earth is, well, compared to God, we really are nothing. One psalm describes the nations of the earth as just a drop in the bucket. Well, if the nations are just a drop in the bucket, then what does that make me? Smaller than a little drip. So the idea that I should be like God is ridiculous. And yet we kind of think somehow that the nature of God can be decided by what we want him to be. And that is even more ridiculous. But it's what we do. And the theological root of the way that we think that way, we've just come across in Genesis 3. Now, what effect does this have on human relationships? Well, firstly, they realize that they're naked. Now, it's not about clothing here. It's about something going on spiritually, because let's remember that male and female are made in the image of God. So there's a spiritual consequence that's going on. And the first part of the spiritual consequence is a sense of their own inadequacy. Now, that inadequacy, of course, is in relation to God and in a relationship with the world, of the ability to be what God has asked humanity to be, which is to go into all the world and subdue it, to rule over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and the creatures that move along the ground. In other words, our challenge to be the stewards of all of creation. Immediately we start to look at that in all its fullness, we're going to realize our inadequacy to fulfill that task. And we know that with the span of human progress has come different ways to damage the environment, even as we've drawn back from the previous ways in which we've done it. We face that challenge in spades right now. And we know that a lot of the grappling that we have in trying to care for our creation is related to our human selfishness, our pride, our lack of humility, our lack of reliance on God through Jesus Christ. They realize that they're naked. Now, what happens is we're told that they take fig leaves to cover themselves. Now, once you start to cover yourself, what you can't do is see yourself. I can't see my skin. I'm actually cut off from examining myself at this point. I can't see myself. So, let's just think this through. The first thing that happens when they put the fig leaves on is that the male can't see the male, the female can't see the female. They have created a gap of understanding between themselves. So women don't fully understand women, male don't fully understand men, because they are no longer fully in touch with themselves spiritually. Secondly, of course, they can't engage with each other fully. The male now is not fully in touch with the female's not fully in touch with the male. they cannot fully engage with each other. There is a covering, there is a gap, and there's a greater level of covering between the skin of the male and the skin of the female, because there's two layers of covering rather than one. So women are out of touch with women. They have a lot in common. There's a lot of intuition going on, but fundamentally there is a problem in relationship with ourselves, with people of our own gender, and with people of the opposite gender. We're cut off from each other in relationship. And so there is a perpetual gap of understanding between male and female that is rooted in what we call the fall in Genesis 3. Now, it then says that God comes walking in the Garden of Eden. And at that point in our story, the male and the female hide. The fig leaves that they've used to cover themselves are inadequate. They need to hide from the presence of God. In other words, it's our natural inclination as spiritual beings to hide ourselves from God. We can hide ourselves from God in various ways. One of the ways of hiding ourselves from God is to worship a God that is not God, but is the way that we prefer God to be. And that God may actually still be an oppressive God. Doesn't have to be a good God. It just has to be one that's compatible with our understanding of the way that the world is. So that might lead us to worship the moon, or to worship another created thing. It might lead us to worship a God which is capricious and oppressive. If life is very unpredictable, it might lead us to worship gods that are very moody and have their own minds. And to be honest, some of the gods that have been worshipped over the centuries have been downright abusive. And of course, there's always a temptation to distort the Christian God in a similar manner. But ultimately, hiding from God is about finding ways to deny his existence. But this has about as much effect on the existence of God as playing a game of peep-bo with a small child. Is God only there when we open our eyes and look at him? Well, this is a God that sees everything, the God that sees everything. So pretending that he's not there sometimes really isn't going to work. So God knows that the man and the woman are out there. He knows that they have fallen so far short of where they should be that they cannot face him even with their coverings. And this is now the gap in relationship between ourselves and God that is called sin. It's a horrible word. It's a word we don't like to use. It's a word that we've tried to talk ourselves out of in the 20th century. But it's reality. It's a tragic reality. And you can see the effects of sin immediately as God begins the inquest. So he starts off by calling to the man, "Where are you?" And the man says, "I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." You notice now the man has got a sense of his inherent shamefulness. In other words, he knows he possesses sin, that his sin is lodged inside of himself. His sin is in his flesh. And because this is a spiritual story, the sin is in his spirit. There's a spiritual problem. So he hides. And the second thing he does is he fails to take personal responsibility. God says, so why is this? And the man says, it's the woman's fault. And so the woman doesn't take personal responsibility. She says, I was deceived by the serpent, and it's the serpent's fault. And so God starts with the serpent. And the serpent is described in Revelation as that ancient serpent, the devil. In other words, in God's universe, in the spiritual realms, there is opposition. There are opposing spiritual beings who wish to be spiritual rulers. So that what the female and the male chose to do in their wish to be like God was to submit to an alternative ruler, which is the devil. And when we do those things which are contrary to what God would want for us, we are submitting to an alternative ruler, to what Ephesians 6 calls powers and principalities. But they're not God. They're not as great as God, and they're not good. They might feel good, they might look good, they might call themselves good. But the New Testament tells us that the devil masquerades as an angel of light. That's why Jesus warns us we can tell a tree by its fruit, so that we will learn to discern the good from the bad. A gift of the Holy Spirit is the discernment of spirits, to know what's truly coming from God. So, part of the spiritual problems facing us as human beings now is recognizing when the devil is at work through his minions, these powers and principalities.